Hey guys, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Plus. Today's topic is going to be training staleness. What is training staleness? Is that when your training goes bad and you have to throw it away? Kind of similar. So here's the deal. In sports science, training staleness is basically when you have a fundamental boredom with your current training. All right. So how does this present? Sometimes training's boring. Is it always staleness? Not really. First of all, it has to be recurrent. So it's not one bad session. It's not one off session. It's kind of like Monday you come in and things aren't feeling so great. Your workouts might go well, but you just kind of don't want to be there. Tuesday, you kind of don't want to be there. You're not super excited about your training anymore. You might have lost a little bit of that long-term vision. You might be asking yourself questions like, why am I here? Like, what's the purpose of training anyway? Now, we all get these kind of thoughts during really high-intensity, high-volume work. When things are really hard, you might have doubts, question like, okay, would I really want to do another set of 10 on the squat? I feel like throwing up. But training staleness is differentiated from just really, really hard work in times of emotional weakness by the fact that you might be warming up for the squat or doing down sets or something not even difficult, and you just have this overwhelming feeling of, ugh, why am I here? Right? And one of the biggest signs that it's for sure training staleness is even if PRs are occurring, you're hitting personal bests or hitting personal records, you still kind of don't want to be there, right? Because usually when you're hitting PRs, everything is golden. It's all gravy. You come in, you hit an all-time max in the squat, you're like, oh my God, this is amazing, and you can't wait to train again. Real training staleness is when you might even be hitting PRs, you get a really good squat, best workout of all time, and your training partner's like, oh my God, that was awesome, and you're kind of like, yeah, it's cool, and you really just don't feel inside that you're super excited about training anymore. And you may very well be on the extreme of training staleness where you might just not want to train at all. You might have these doubts about why am I even doing this whole sport, etc. And this is the kind of thing again that doesn't happen over a training session. It happens over several training sessions, and usually you really know when it's happening. It's occurring over several weeks. When and to who does this happen? Well, so we don't really have a term for training staleness for beginners, because when you're a beginner, things can't go stale for you yet. When beginners have trouble with motivation, that's really, and we cover this in another RP Plus lecture, that's really a kind of a motivation inspiration problem. You haven't caught the drift yet. Training staleness is something that is reserved for people for whom training is already habitual. It's already habit. It's already a big part of their life. So you're a more advanced athlete, you've been doing your sport, you've been doing your recreational activities for a while, months, years, and then you start to kind of burn out. That's training staleness. It's not like, my training partner who's just started training, has been training for 2 weeks and then he got bored. That's not really staleness. That's just a lack of inspiration to begin with, right? So the most common way people get into that, and there are kind of more overarching things like I didn't like the sport to begin with. That's a bit more of a different concern. But usually it's by taking a certain exercise selection and approach to training, like let's say doing sets of 10 in a particular arrangement of exercises or training for hypertrophy, and basically going for more than 4 to 6 months in that pattern. So in the first 2 or 3 months of training for strength or for endurance or for hypertrophy or a new selection of exercises, things are generally pretty exciting. You hit good PRs, you might hit them either way, but things are new and they feel fresh. After about 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, if the same kind of training is occurring, I mean, down to the rep range, exercise selection, intensity variations, if that's what's happening, you might find yourself in a more high likelihood of sort of incurring into the zone of training staleness. It's like Groundhog Day. Every day starts to feel the same, and that can cause some problems. First problem is kind of more of a philosophical problem. Almost everyone in the United States and generally in advanced countries today, wherever you are around the world listening to this, you don't train for a job, right? And even if you're an athlete, you don't have to be an athlete, right? You can be training for the Olympics, but how much money is that paying you? You're probably living at, pretty low means training for the Olympics, and it's because you want to train like that, right? So fundamentally, why do we train? Well, it's because we like to train. And if training's not fun anymore, if it literally feels like a day job, like a grind at the office, why are we there, right? Well, that's issue number one. So before we get into the adaptation and the sort of training demand problems, you got to ask yourself, if training's consistently very stale, Why am I training? Because we started all this to be fun anyway, right? That's why we train. Aside from that, let's say fundamentally you're still having fun in your training and the goal is still in sight, or maybe you're a really high-level athlete and the fun part is like, okay, but this is my job, so it's kind of you obviating fun to begin with. What are some problems? Well, when your training is stale, you're going to have trouble training as hard as you need to make your best adaptations. So when you have really, really stale training, you're less likely to get amped up enough to make the big jumps in weight, in speed, and endurance, and PRs that really make the overload the best. That's a big problem. Remember, especially if you're advanced, you only really get better through hard training anyway, right? And if you have a problem with summoning the sufficient intensity, you literally walk up to the squat bar, and your first thought isn't, I'm going to kill this. Your first thought is, squats again. Okay, that's a bad deal, right? And you don't want to be in that position per se. Second of all, let's say you can summon the intensity necessary to make adaptations. You might find yourself in a position, and I think when I say this, a lot of this is going to resonate with you guys, and you might have been in the situation before, your ability to do the total work required can decrease, right? So what do I mean by that? That means if your training is pretty stale, you might be able to get through your hard primary sets, your first 4 sets of 6 reps or something like that. You hit them good, everything's fine. But after you have to do your down sets, and we know that volume is critical to adaptations, down sets are important. You have to finish your workouts, do all the volume to get all the gains. You might still be okay doing the primary work, but then you get into your secondary work, and you're like, it says, my sheet says 3 sets of 8 of stiff-legged deadlifts. Oh, God, it's so monotonous. I'm going to do 2 sets of 6, a bit heavier, make it a bit more exciting, right? Have you ever altered your own training just to make it more exciting in the moment? And they'll call it quits. Now, it's good to have training that's exciting, but training has to follow a plan. If your periodized plan, if the objective is to hit 4 sets of 8, 2 sets of 6, even though it's hard training, is not in the same direction as you want. It's insufficient volume and perhaps doesn't contribute as much to muscle growth. It's more of a strength exercise. It might not get you what you're looking after. So a lot of people can still train very hard when their training gets stale, but they have a really hard time completing all the necessary work. So basically, as they get tired throughout the training session, they're more likely to cut some things off and be like, man, do I really need to do cable flies today? I had some really good pressing today. I hit a couple PRs. I'm just going to go home. I'm just going to shut it down. That's a problem because while it's not a problem right there and then in the session, it doesn't build a foundation and the framework for more results later down the line. Lastly, probably the most extreme example of training staleness short of just walking away and quitting is replacing exercises altogether. And a lot of times staleness is exercise specific. You're just so tired of high bar squats, you're so tired of stiff-legged deadlifts that you do anything else to not do them. And you might be very well motivated by training still, but it's the exercises themselves that have gotten so stale on you that particular movement pattern is just annoying, right? Everything feels all wrong. You hate it. You don't want to do it. So a lot of times individuals will have 4 sets of 8 stiff-legged deadlifts planned, and they'll go and combine the two. So they'll do a lower intensity, lower volume, and they'll switch out exercises altogether. So what I mean by that, they'll do 2 sets of 5 of glute ham raises. So glute ham raises may very well be a good hamstring exercise, but if you randomly do exercises here and there, you violate the principles of specificity, particularly directed adaptation, because the reason you chose your exercises was they had a particular purpose in your plan. Just subbing out exercises here and there isn't the most optimal way to train. And if you're doing it because you planned the variation, that's perfect. But if you're simply bored and you want to do something else just because, you understand now that you are trading off the efficiency of your program for an enhanced level of entertainment. Not the best scenario, right? So it's not that staleness is one of those things that you just have to work through it, brother. It presents some serious challenges. So let's learn a little bit more about it, right? Okay, so training staleness is a real thing. What causes training staleness? There's 2 fundamental potential causes, and one of them can actually influence the other, though not the other way around. So, first cause is literally a physical cause. It's a physiological cause. It's not initially psychological, but it spills over. It's accumulated fatigue, right? So if you continue to train super duper hard and your training starts to exceed your ability to recover, your level of accumulated fatigue starts to really rise. As your accumulated fatigue gets high enough, and this has been demonstrated very clearly in overreaching and overtraining literature and sports science, what ends up happening is your physiology gets dampened and depressed, your ability to adapt gets dampened and depressed, your ability to perform gets dampened and depressed, you start getting hurt more, and there's always a predictable effect on psychology, and training staleness is one of those effects. So there's actually, they used to use a term, and sometimes people still do, they'll use the term overtraining and training staleness concomitantly. They'll use the terms together or to replace each other because it's that closely tied. So basically, one of the most reliable indicators that you're overreached, that you've gone further than you can recover from, that your cumulative fatigue is too high, is that training staleness results psychologically. So you know someone's in a bad situation with too much fatigue when one of the symptoms is I just don't even want to come in and train. I'd rather do something else, or when I train, I don't want to stick to the plan. So it's possible that there's a literal physical cause. Hint at something I'm going to say in a little bit more detail. If you alleviate the physical symptoms and you reduce the fatigue, a lot of times the psychology comes rushing back. So you thought you hated exercise, but it turns out you were so beat up, that's why you hated it. And as soon as we alleviate the fatigue, you're back to just doing your thing and you love training again. However, there is a second reason for training staleness, the more obviously direct one, is just psychological boredom. Right? And that can occur even in low fatigue states. You don't have to be beat up. You can be in a really low fatigue state and just be literally bored with your training. There's a couple potential reasons for that, right? One of them is your ability, or just sort of the chances or the occurrences of PRs gets fewer and further between. If you're doing a particularly low volume training phase, or a low volume training block, maybe to recover for something, or if you're working on an ability that you're just not very good at and it's very difficult for you to progress there, that lack of PRs can create training staleness because there's nothing exciting to look forward to. An example of this is if you're really attached to being stronger and faster and fitter in a number sense and performance, and you have to do a fat loss diet. Well, towards the end of the fat loss diet, you're going to be hitting all kinds of PRs in your appearance. But you might not be hitting PRs in your performance because you're low on fuel, you're low on glycogen, you're high on fatigue. That can lead to training staleness because you literally kind of forget why you're in the gym. Someone's like, hey, how's your back squat coming up? And you're like, I don't remember the last time I hit a PR on the back squat. And they're like, oh, that kind of sucks. And you're like, yeah, I know. And all of a sudden, your training's really stale. You come in and you're like, I know I have to train today to keep my muscle on my body while I lose this fat. But because you're not hitting PRs, it's real tough to get motivated for that sort of thing, and training staleness can arise. Now, mind you, it's not because you're in a high fatigue state, it's because you haven't hit PRs in a long time. And a lot of people who are really PR driven, which is totally cool, have some problems when they're not getting better all the time, or at least some of the time. Phases in which they have to back off from getting better and work on other things like fat loss can be really hard for them and can create a lot of staleness. And another one, probably the most common, is just a sheer amount of time spent in the same current training modalities. So for example, if you just high bar squat for months and months and months, and you do a lot of the same rep ranges, especially sets of 10 and 8 for months and months and months, you can get so sick of high bar squatting for sets of 10 and 8 that is what causes training staleness. It's the same kind of training. Right? This can be expanded, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit, even to an entire sport. Now that's more rare, but you could be so sick of doing squats, bench presses, and deadlifts that you want to do anything else but that, right? You start being like, am I even a power lifter anymore? Why am I doing this, right? So essentially, we have this possibility that the sort of causes of staleness are physiological, that it's too much fatigue, or just purely psychological, right? So we have a problem here because we have to be able to tell which is which, right? You want to solve the problem of staleness, for sure. But before you can tell where it's coming from, you've got to make sure that you know, before you can fix it, you got to know where it's coming from, right? Because we could fix the wrong thing and then still be in a really big bind. So how do we tell if our staleness is physically mediated, right? Accumulated fatigue, psychological, or both, right? So both training fatigue and boredom, just psychological boredom, can produce staleness. However, only fatigue comes with the other fatigue symptoms. So we can find out if it's just psychological boredom if the following things that I'm going to list to you, just as a sample, are not present. Okay? So if you have no motivation-induced performance loss, okay, non-motivation-induced performance loss. So for example, you're still amped up, okay, you're still ready to go, but you're just not as strong as you used to be. You're just not as fast as you used to be. Your endurance is down and you can't tell why. You're psyched up plenty. It's not like you're coming in and getting the bar or getting on the rowing machine and going, oh, I can't believe I have to do this. You're ready to go, but you're just not as good. That's a fatigue issue. That's not a boredom issue. That's a sign of high fatigue, and that's probably where your staleness is coming from. Low-level chronic muscle soreness is another one. That's a big sign of fatigue, right? If you're always kind of beat up, you're probably overreaching your ability to recover, and that's fatigue that's causing the staleness as well. If you have joint aches and pains, right? Psychological boredom doesn't cause joint aches and pains. That would be one hell of a level of boredom. Only accumulated fatigue can really do that in the long term. If you have that, it's probably a physiological issue. And again, poor appetite, problems with sleep, a deteriorating dynamic technique. So one of the early signs of overreaching when you have way too much fatigue is if you have really a lot of trouble hitting weightlifting movements and getting under the bar, or being super technical and explosive. When your ability to do a high level of technique at fast speed starts to degrade in addition with some of those other symptoms, you're probably physiologically overreached, too fatigued, and that's probably where the staleness is coming from as well, right? So if none of those symptoms are present when staleness occurs, if you feel pretty fresh physically, you don't have trouble sleeping, you're still fast and quick, then it's probably just psychological. When those situations are present, it's either both psychological or physical in derivative, or just physical, but that means it spills over into the psychological as well. Now, how do you deal with staleness? Here's the deal. We have kind of a one-size-fits-all method for, or one-size-fits-all method for the taking staleness. And if you're already in a position of staleness, we'll talk in just a second about what you can do to prevent it. But if you're already in a position of staleness, what can we do to mitigate it? The first thing, and it's almost always a good idea, is to just take a deload. You may not think you're fatigued, because you may have answered some of those questions in the last little chat about what signs there are as no, I don't have them. But just in case, because sometimes fatigue can be masked by a variety of other things, you can still feel kind of decent and still be carrying enough fatigue to get training stale, just take a deload just in case. And that works psychologically as well as physically. Sometimes what you're staling out on is the sheer act of trying hard. When you take a deload, which means a week or so of lower volume, lower intensity training, you may find yourself reigniting the passion to train super hard because it turns out that you were just training hard for so long, it was the psychological burden of having to try that hard all the time. You spend a little bit of time away from the gym, you get that fire back, that desire. A lot of the world's most motivated athletes hate deloading because at the end of it, they feel completely insane. They have to spill it out onto the platform, onto the rings, onto the track. They have to try hard. And a lot of times staleness occurs from trying hard so long, you don't even want to try hard anymore. When you do a deload, first of all, it can clear up a lot of fatigue, which is great, and also it can help psychologically as well. After your deload, it's a good idea to keep that staleness at bay by switching exercise selections or the arrangement of your training, which training days you come in and train what body parts or what modalities. You can change your training frequency, change the intensity range. As opposed to lifting in sets of 3 to 5, you could start lifting in sets of 10 to 15 or something like that. Your volume range, work on an entirely new priority, switch that training up, make sure things are fresh. And lastly, at the very extremes of psychological staleness, you might want to try a new goal altogether. Right? What do I mean by that? In very rare situations, you may have pushed it so far in a single sport or a single goal that you just don't want to do that sport or that goal for a while. And that's totally okay. Now, try not to have that be your first choice. Try to alter your training a little bit within that sport or that goal first. But if that doesn't work, if after a couple of weeks everything's already just as stale as ever, or it never helped to begin with, you can try this. So for example, if you've been gaining strength for a while in whatever sport you play, say you're a powerlifter or a CrossFitter, you've been going strength, strength, strength. You might be burned out on the very idea, the very mechanisms, the very things it takes to get strong. The ways of training might have burned you out. You might be stale. Try a fat loss phase, right? In a fat loss phase, you switch your training from strength training to more hypertrophy training to keep your muscle on, and that new change in your body, not only can it enhance your performance in the long term, but it can really reinvigorate you and give a big psychological and physical break from strength training. So that when you're at the end of the fat loss phase, you can't wait to lift heavy again, you can't wait to strength train again, and that break is all you needed. So a fat loss phase of several months might do the trick, just changing your training in a different direction. Sometimes, especially if you're choosing related sports, or if you happen to be involved in CrossFit and you can choose some emphases over others, you might go a different direction altogether and do a different sport for a while. I've known some powerlifters, for example, that have tried more CrossFit when they got really burnt out on powerlifting, or the other way around. If you've been training for CrossFit for a while, you might put your endurance and high rep training on back burner for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Train for a powerlifting meet, right? Train for a weightlifting meet. Maybe even consider at the extreme end a physique show or something if you're pretty lean to begin with. If you're any of the strength sports or the power sports or a CrossFitter, you can switch in for a couple of months, really train one attribute or even try to compete in another sport. That can really reinvigorate you because you'll start missing the old stuff that was making it stale. But if you're a CrossFitter and you haven't done, an endurance workout in a long time, 8 weeks, the very same endurance workouts that used to make you want to quit, you're now aching for them because it's been so long. So switching your emphasis altogether might be a good idea. It's better to switch exercise selections and modalities and all of those minor things and stick to the same goal first, because we don't want to switch sports all the time. It's not going to make us much better in the long term to do that too frequently. But if it really gets at you, if it's really stale, you might consider switching things up altogether and going from one sport to the other. Last part here. Okay, so we know how to deal with staleness now when it comes up, but how do we prevent staleness from occurring? Because you don't want to be in a situation where you just keep running into walls and having to use these tips to rearrange your program, right? You want to make sure staleness doesn't really hit in any big way at the beginning. Now, big caveat to what I'm going to say. Staleness is okay for about a week at a time, here or there, at your peak weeks of every mesocycle. So the week right before you deload, you should be overreached, because that tells us you're training hard enough to get all your adaptations, and it sets us up for functional overreaching. That supercompensation effect of training that makes you really much better can only occur when you've really beat yourself up. Training should be a little stale in those last weeks, because if training isn't a little stale in those last weeks, you're probably not training hard enough. And remember, you always have a deload after them to completely wipe that away. But if training staleness is occurring more than in just the last week, you have a problem. How do we avoid that problem to begin with? First of all, follow a periodized, phasic plan to begin with. You want a logical, phasic approach to your training, right? That means that every several months, you shift focus, so from hypertrophy to strength to power, or work capacity to hypertrophy, and then back to work capacity, from an emphasis on doing gymnastics movements to weightlifting movements to power movements, and so on and so forth, putting things in the back burner, putting things to the front end in a logical, phasic manner. That is proper training design. And one of the reasons it works so beautifully is, of course, the physiology of it. But another one, a minor but yet good reason, is the psychology of it. Periodized training, where you move from phase to phase to phase, keeps it fresh all the time. But the good thing is, it doesn't just keep it randomly fresh. It keeps it fresh in the direction in which you want. Right? There's a very big difference there. You don't want to be the kind of person that gets bored with training every 2 weeks and varies it so much they go nowhere, right? But you do want to be the kind of person that doesn't stall out all the time while staleness, because you're doing the same program for 18 months. So your program should be phasic and should have phases of distinct training that build on each other, right? And we'll have more lectures for you later on periodization and how to make that arrangement. But generally speaking, you want to make sure you go from phase to phase to phase. That allows you to not be super beat down with staleness, yet stick to the same end goal and keep building towards the same thing. When you are designing your training blocks, make sure your blocks of training don't last much longer than about 4 months at one time. You can have the same sets, exercises, reps, etc. for 4 months at a time, and that's okay. Much after 4 months, training staleness is almost guaranteed to arise. Not only that, your physiological ability to adapt is also going to start to diminish. You should at least change some exercises or some repetition ranges, or maybe some timing issues or frequency issues, to give yourself both a growth spurt and a psychological help. So a lot of times people say, I found the perfect program, and they run the same program and they're like, oh my God, I'm so bored with it. Before you get bored, you should be planning to change your program at various intervals, 3 to 4 months on average, to make sure that you're both progressing physiologically and not getting too stale. Lastly, you want to make sure that your psychological alignment in your own head with your training is fundamentally sound. What does that mean? Remember why you're training. It's to have fun. It's to increase the vivaciousness of your life. It is to make you a happier person, a healthier person, a stronger person, a fitter person. Imagine training as a supermarket shopping spree that is given to you for free, and you're just grabbing up as many tasty items off the shelf and putting them into your cart. That's what training is. It's an opportunity to gain, to improve. If you start to see training as more of a job, as a mandate, as a requirement, as drudgery, there's no way you're going to be able to avoid staleness. But if you come into training and every now and again psychologically realign yourself to make sure you're focusing on the idea that training is fun and productive. This can be expanded to your day job. If you're at your day job to create value for yourself, value for the company, to make yourself more productive, to create beautiful products and services for other people to make them happy, the realization that you're doing that is all the motivation you'll ever need to never be stale. But if you come to work, clock in 8 to 5, 9 to 5, and you don't even know why you're there. It's essentially, as far as you're concerned, a form of slavery at that point. You're there resisting with every bone in your body to be there. You're going to hate your job. Training can be the same thing. Yeah, we all understand fundamentally that training is voluntarily and, totally up for us to do, but sometimes we lose that touch. We lose sight of that psychologically in our own heads. It's a real good idea every now and again to come back and remember why you love training. Remember what the purpose of training is. And like I said, it's kind of like an all-you-can-grab shopping spree. There's hypertrophy here, there's strength here, there's fat loss here. You're getting a ton of stuff. You're creating something every time you train. Not only is the process awesome and fun, but the end goals are something you want. If you can keep that in mind, geez, staleness is really hard to come by. And about that process, the last thing I'll tell you guys today, have fun in your training day to day, and the best way to do that was with some awesome training partners. If you have training partners that can help you have fun in your training day to day, they can watch your technique, you can BS with them between sets and make fun of each other, that's going to be so much more fun that you're going to forget that training is work at all. You're going to look forward to your training, and in addition to keeping that long-term view of your training as a productive endeavor to build something, so it's productive inside our own psychology, and our training partners help make it fun. Well, holy crap, productive and fun. Nobody's ever going to have to talk you out of that. Staleness is going to be something that can only occur if you really screw up your training design and do the same stuff for months and months and months. As long as you keep to all those, training staleness should be something that occurs only really when you're overreaching, and then after you deal with it, you should be all good to go. You can continue to train more or less staleness free, have your best gains, and enjoy everything about training, including the rest of your life. Thanks for tuning in. See you guys next time.